Have you ever had someone try to ban you from something that's technically yours? It's not just frustrating, it can feel like your very existence is being challenged, like someone is trying to strip away something that belongs to you, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem to others. Imagine sitting by a peaceful lake, testing out fishing equipment you designed by hand, when suddenly, a stranger confronts you, accuses you of trespassing, and claims you're violating laws that no one even knew existed. My name is Nolan West. I'm 36 years old, and I make custom fishing nets. You might think that sounds strange, but it's my passion. I spend hours designing and testing these nets, ensuring they perform as they should in real water conditions. And to do that, I need a place that's quiet and undisturbed, a place where I can throw my lines without worrying about the world around me. For the past 6 months, I'd been renting a small house on Oak Street in the Sunset Lake community. The area was peaceful, with a beautiful lake that seemed perfect for testing my nets. I would sit by the water, take my time, and make sure each piece of equipment worked under real conditions. The calmness of the lake, the soft breeze, and the rhythmic lapping of water against the shore made it the perfect spot to unwind, to test, and to perfect my craft. But that morning was different. It was supposed to be like any other day. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, and I had my folding chair set up on the grassy bank, my testing equipment laid out neatly beside me. I was in the middle of checking how my latest fishing net design worked with different casting techniques when I first noticed her. She was standing off in the distance, phone in hand, clearly watching me. At first, I thought nothing of it. People sometimes took photos of the lake. Maybe she was one of those who appreciated the beauty of the place. What I didn't expect was what happened next. She marched straight toward me, her phone raised high, snapping pictures as if I were committing some heinous crime. I was still sitting there, focused on my work, trying to perfect my cast, when suddenly, she was there, standing in front of me, her voice booming across the lake. "You can't fish here," she shouted, her tone shrill, like I had just dumped toxic waste into her pristine garden. I froze, mid-cast, looking up at her in disbelief. I had no idea who she was, but her energy screamed authority. She wasn't asking, she was accusing. "Excuse me?" I asked, still trying to make sense of what was happening. "I'm just testing some fishing equipment." Her answer came quickly, as if she had been rehearsing it for days. "Fishing is not permitted here. This is private property, reserved exclusively for homeowners of the Sunset Lake community." I glanced around, bewildered. No signs, no fences, nothing that screamed, private property. It was just a lake, surrounded by peaceful homes. She went on, rattling off regulations I had never heard of. "This is HOA property. The rules are clear. You are trespassing, and you need to leave immediately." At this point, I stood up, trying to understand what was going on. "There's nothing here that says this is private property," I told her. "I've been living here for months, and I've never seen any signs or warnings about restricted access to the lake." She didn't care. "This lake is for the exclusive use of the homeowners," she insisted, raising her voice, clearly trying to escalate the situation. "You're violating Sunset Lake community regulations, and I am responsible for ensuring that these rules are followed. As president of the HOA, it's my job to protect this community's property value." I stared at her, completely stunned. "I'm not causing any harm. I'm just testing my equipment. There's no disturbance, no noise, no litter. Just a man, a chair, and some fishing nets." But she wouldn't listen. She wasn't interested in compromising. She wasn't interested in understanding. Diane Crowley, yes, that was her name, I found out later, was on a mission. She reached for her walkie-talkie and pressed the button. "Security team, this is Diane. We have an unauthorized individual at the lake who is refusing to comply with community regulations," she reported, as though I was some kind of criminal. The crackling noise from the walkie-talkie was followed by silence. No response. She tried again, more insistently this time, but no one answered. As she stood there, waiting for backup that didn't exist, I started to get a better sense of who I was dealing with. Diane wasn't just trying to enforce rules, she genuinely believed that she had the right to control who could access the lake and who couldn't. I looked around again. It was a beautiful morning. No one else was at the lake. Just me, testing my nets. She finally turned to me, her face stern. "You're either going to leave voluntarily," she said, "or I'll call the authorities." I was taken aback. "You're calling the police because I'm fishing?" I asked. It sounded absurd, but she was dead serious. Her eyes narrowed, and she pulled out her phone again, clearly preparing to dial 911. "Yes," she said, with complete certainty. "I'll be calling the police to report a trespasser. And I'll be posting your picture on the community forum to warn others about unauthorized fishing." The realization hit me then. Diane wasn't just enforcing rules, she was willing to go to great lengths to prove she had control, to make me the villain in a story that I didn't even know I was part of. I stood there, watching her, a mix of confusion and disbelief swirling inside me. Was this really happening? Was I about to be arrested for fishing? And then, just as I was processing the absurdity of the situation, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "Don't let her push you around. That lake doesn't belong to them." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Someone else knew something about the lake that Diane didn't. I had a feeling that whatever secret was hidden here, it was about to come to light, and it was going to change everything. As the minutes passed, the tension in the air thickened. Diane, still holding her phone like a weapon, was now in full-on HOA mode. She was pacing back and forth, muttering under her breath, her eyes flicking between me and the lake. I could almost feel the heat of her disapproval radiating from her, as if my very presence was contaminating the tranquil atmosphere she believed she controlled. I remained seated, my hands gripping the sides of my chair, trying to stay calm. What had started as an ordinary day, one where I had only hoped to test my fishing nets, had suddenly turned into something that felt like an interrogation. Diane, however, was unwavering. She had decided that I was the enemy. The distant sound of tires crunching against gravel interrupted my thoughts. A police cruiser had arrived, and with it, the heavy weight of inevitability. Officer Mike Johnson stepped out of the vehicle with the resigned look of someone who had seen it all, who had dealt with the petty grievances of HOA wars more times than he cared to count. His approach was slow, deliberate, as if he had been preparing for yet another showdown in the never-ending saga of neighborhood disputes. I braced myself. Diane, clearly eager to present her case, wasted no time. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying an edge of authority, "this man is trespassing on private property. He's refusing to leave, and he's been using the lake for unauthorized fishing activities." Her words hung in the air, her eyes never leaving me. It was as if she were expecting Officer Johnson to immediately take her side, to back her up and throw me off the property. But Officer Johnson didn't respond right away. He didn't give her the satisfaction she was expecting. Instead, he turned to me, his expression neutral, but his gaze piercing. "Sir, what's your understanding of the situation?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting for so long, and faced the officer. "I'm just testing my fishing equipment," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been renting a house on Oak Street for about 6 months, and I didn't realize that this lake was off limits. There are no signs, no barriers, nothing indicating that I shouldn't be here." Officer Johnson's eyes scanned the area, taking in the peaceful surroundings. It was a beautiful morning, the kind of morning that made you forget about the petty squabbles of the world. The only sounds were the soft chirping of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. There were no fences. No private property signs. Nothing. He turned back to Diane, his expression unchanging. "Ma'am, I don't see any physical markers indicating that this area is private property. Where are the boundaries? Diane's face flushed a shade of red that was almost comical. She quickly rattled off the same regulations she had cited earlier, but the more she spoke, the more it became clear that her argument was based on assumptions, not on any real documentation. She spoke of HOA rules, covenants, and regulations, but none of it made sense in the context of the situation. If the lake was truly private property, why wasn't it marked as such? She gestured toward the expensive homes that lined the far side of the lake, as if that somehow made her case stronger. This is for the homeowners only, she insisted. This is a private amenity that helps maintain property values. We can't have outsiders using it without permission. I couldn't help but shake my head. I understand that the community has its rules, but I'm not disturbing anyone. I'm not causing any issues. I'm just here to test my equipment. Officer Johnson, clearly growing weary of the situation, turned to Diane. Ma'am, I'm not seeing a violation of any laws here. This seems like a civil matter, an issue between neighbors. But I can't arrest someone for fishing when there's no law against it. Diane, however, wasn't ready to let go. She pressed on, her voice growing more insistent. But you don't understand. This isn't just about fishing. This is about unauthorized use of property. If we allow random people to come in and use the lake, it will destroy the community. It will ruin everything we've worked for. Her words echoed in my mind, destroy the community. I wasn't just fishing. I was somehow threatening the very fabric of this place. But her insistence felt hollow. I wasn't a criminal. I was just a guy trying to do his job, testing fishing nets that I'd spent months perfecting. And yet here I was, standing before her, accused of something I hadn't even realized I was doing. Officer Johnson sighed, rubbing his temples. He had clearly dealt with situations like this more times than he cared to count. Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but this is a private matter between neighbors. The police can't intervene unless there's a legal violation. If this is about property rights, you'll need to take it up with a lawyer, not the police. Diane's frustration was palpable. Her voice grew sharper. This is about protecting our community, she shouted, her hands trembling with the intensity of her belief. If we don't maintain control, if we don't enforce the rules, everything will fall apart. Officer Johnson nodded slowly, clearly trying to avoid a confrontation. I understand, but I don't see any criminal activity here. If this is a civil dispute, you'll have to handle it through the proper legal channels. The tension was thick, but just as Diane opened her mouth to argue further, something unexpected happened. A voice called out from behind us. An elderly woman, probably in her 70s, appeared from one of the nearby houses, walking slowly but with purpose. She had been watching everything unfold from her window, and now, she was stepping in. Her name was Betty Williams, and she had lived in the Sunset Lake community for years. She had been a witness to something Diane didn't know, something that was about to turn the entire situation on its head. Betty slowly walked up to us, her eyes full of quiet wisdom. I think you both need to know something, she said, her voice calm but strong. Diane, still seething with anger, looked at her dismissively. And who are you? She asked, clearly not interested in hearing anything from an outsider. But Betty wasn't deterred. She looked me in the eyes and said, You're Nolan West, right? Your father, Robert West, he was one of the original landowners here. He had a vision for this lake that's more important than anything Diane can say. I turned to Betty, confused. What are you talking about? I asked, the pieces of the puzzle slowly beginning to fall into place. Betty nodded. Robert West was very clear about one thing. He wanted the lake to be a public space, accessible to everyone. When he sold most of the land to the developers, he kept the lake. He didn't want it to become a private amenity for the wealthy few. Her words hit me like a jolt of electricity. My father had owned the lake. He had kept it when he sold the rest of the land. I had never known this. My father had passed away 3 years ago, and I had handled his estate, but never had I heard a word about a lake, let alone property that included it. Betty continued, I remember those days well. Robert fought hard to make sure this lake was kept public, not just for his family but for the community. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what Betty was saying. This wasn't just a property dispute. This was about my father's legacy. Something he had worked for, something he had fought to preserve. And now, it was in my hands. The words Betty had shared hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My father had owned the lake. He had kept it, not just for himself, but for the community, ensuring that it would remain accessible to all, not just a select few. I felt the weight of this realization sinking in, as if the ground beneath me had shifted. I had never known about this lake property, but now, it felt like a missing piece of a much larger puzzle. Diane, however, was not ready to let go. The idea that the lake didn't belong to the HOA, something she had worked so hard to control, was a blow she couldn't accept. Her face turned redder as she tried to dismiss Betty's words, almost as if by doing so, she could erase the truth. But the more she tried to convince herself, the more desperate her tone became. That's impossible, she snapped, her voice strained. If that were true, it would be documented. No one just keeps property like that without proper legal backing. But I could see it in her eyes, doubt, confusion, and beneath it all, fear. The fear of losing control. The fear that everything she had worked for, everything she had assumed, was crumbling. Officer Johnson, who had been standing quietly, took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain his patience. Ma'am, I think it's time we get some clarity on this, he said, his tone calm yet firm. If Mr. West's father kept the lake, then it belongs to him. And if that's the case, the HOA doesn't have the authority to regulate it. You can't just claim ownership because of a few community rules. Diane's face was a mix of disbelief and anger. She didn't want to accept that the lake wasn't under the HOA's control. She had spent years cultivating that sense of authority, and now, with the truth right in front of her, it was all falling apart. I turned to Betty, feeling the weight of the situation settling on me. How do you know all of this? I asked, my voice trembling slightly from the realization of what was at stake. Betty smiled warmly, a kind of knowing smile that only someone who had seen decades of history could give. I've lived here long enough to know the stories. Your father made sure that everyone knew how he felt about the lake. He didn't want it to become a private club for the rich. He fought for the people, for the community. And I remember him telling me that he kept the lake for future generations. To make sure it didn't get lost in the pursuit of money and status. Her words hit me like a wave. My father's intentions were clear now. He had kept that lake because he believed in something bigger than property values or private ownership. He had fought to make sure that the lake would always belong to the people, to the community, not just the homeowners who happened to live near it. I stood still for a moment, absorbing everything Betty had said. The lake wasn't just a body of water, it was a symbol of my father's values, of his belief in accessibility and fairness. And now, it was mine to protect. I need to look through my father's things, I said, my voice steady now. If what Betty says is true, there must be some documentation, something that proves this. Officer Johnson nodded. I'd recommend that you do. If you can prove that the lake belongs to you, then there's no legal argument here. Diane and the HOA can't stop you from using it. I turned to Diane, who was still fuming but now unsure of how to proceed. You've made your case, but I think I need to look into this further. I'll get back to you with the proof. In the meantime, I'm going to continue using the lake, as I have every right to. Diane didn't respond immediately. She stood there, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. Finally, she turned and walked away, her head held high, but the cracks in her armor were clear. She was losing control, and she knew it. As the situation began to settle, I felt the reality of what had just unfolded weigh heavily on my shoulders. The conflict was far from over, but the truth was on my side. I had to find the documents, the proof that my father had indeed retained ownership of the lake. And once I did, there would be no turning back. The next day, I went to my father's old garage, a place I hadn't set foot in since his passing 3 years ago. The garage smelled like wood and dust, a familiar scent that brought back memories of days spent with my father, working on projects together. But now, as I stood there, surrounded by boxes of old papers, I felt a sense of urgency. I had to find the documents that would prove my claim to the lake. I spent hours sifting through boxes, flipping through old folders, trying to find anything related to the lake. There were receipts, letters, and legal documents related to various properties my father had owned, but nothing that directly referenced the lake. Just when I was about to give up, I found it, a folder marked Sunset Lake Property. My heart raced as I opened it. Inside was a deed, properly notarized and recorded with the county. It was a record of my father's original land purchase, the sale to the developers, and most importantly, a separate deed that showed he had retained ownership of a 12-acre parcel of land that included the entire lake and a 50-foot buffer zone around it. I couldn't believe it. The documents were there, in black and white, confirming that my father had indeed kept the lake. And the best part? The deed had transferred to me as part of his estate. I owned the lake. But it wasn't just the legal documents that caught my attention. There was also a letter, addressed to me, written by my father just 2 months before his death. Dear Nolan, it began. If you're reading this, it means you've discovered the lake property, probably because someone has challenged your right to be there. I kept this land when I sold everything else because I believe that natural spaces should be accessible to everyone, not just people who can afford expensive homes. The lake belongs to our family and trust for the community's enjoyment. Protect this lake from monopolization, and don't be afraid to fight if you're right. I sat there in the quiet of the garage, holding that letter in my hands. My father had known that someone would try to take the lake from the community, and he had made sure that I was ready to defend it. He had trusted me to protect what he had fought for. The weight of his words, "Don't be afraid to fight if you're right," echoed in my mind. This wasn't just about fishing. It was about honoring my father's vision, about ensuring that the lake remained a space for everyone, not just the privileged few. I knew what I had to do. I had to stand up for what was right. I had to protect the lake, not just for myself, but for the community my father had cared so deeply about. The fight was far from over, but now, I had the proof. And with that proof, I would show Diane and the HOA that they couldn't control something that wasn't theirs to begin with. The next morning, I returned to the lake with the folder in hand. My mind was racing with the implications of what I had uncovered. This wasn't just a dispute about fishing rights, it was about the very heart of the community, the foundation on which Sunset Lake had been built. As I approached my usual spot by the water, I saw Diane again. This time, she wasn't alone. She had brought reinforcements, 3 other members of the HOA board, all walking toward me with serious expressions, like a well-oiled machine on a mission. Their collective energy was different now, more official, more intimidating. Diane led the group, her body language firm, as though she had already decided how this encounter was going to play out. But this time, I wasn't just a guy with a fishing net. I was someone armed with the truth, with the legal documents that proved my claim. And I wasn't going to back down. "Mr. West," Diane called out, her voice carrying a tone of official authority. "We need to discuss the situation regarding your unauthorized use of community property." She made it sound as if I had been caught committing a crime. "The HOA board has met in emergency session and we're prepared to make you a reasonable offer. We suggest that you temporarily cease all fishing activities in this area until our legal team can resolve any questions about property boundaries and usage rights." Her tone was condescending, as if she were doing me a favor by offering me this reasonable solution. But I wasn't buying it. I stood up slowly, the folder of documents clutched in my hand. I had a calm determination about me now, a quiet confidence that came from knowing I was right. "That's very kind of you to offer," I said, my voice steady. "But I think we need to have a more serious conversation about this situation." I held up the folder so they could all see it clearly. "Yesterday afternoon, I spent hours going through my father's papers, like Mrs. Williams suggested. And I discovered something that changes everything about this dispute." Diane's face immediately turned pale, her expression shifting from arrogant confidence to something resembling panic. She had no idea what was coming. The others on the HOA board exchanged nervous glances, clearly aware that the dynamic had shifted. "What kind of information?" one of them asked, his voice betraying more anxiety than curiosity. I opened the folder and pulled out the deed, holding it up for them to see. "It turns out that my father owned this lake and the surrounding property," I said, watching their faces as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "When he sold the land for this community development, he kept the lake area for himself. And according to this deed, I now own the 12 acres that include the entire lake, along with a 50-foot buffer zone extending from the shoreline." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Diane reached for the deed with shaking hands, her face a mask of disbelief. She looked at the official county recording stamp, and then at the legal description, her mind working furiously to process the implications of what she was seeing. The other HOA members crowded around her, reading over her shoulder, their expressions shifting from confusion to fear. This can't be right," Diane finally stammered, her voice weak. "The lake has always been part of the community's amenities. It's been managed by the HOA since the development was built. We've maintained it for years." I stood firm, my gaze unwavering. "I don't just own the water's surface," I continued. "I own the heart of this community, the lake, the shoreline, everything. And now, you're going to have to accept that." The silence that followed was deafening. Diane's grip on the deed tightened, but her confidence was gone. She could no longer deny the truth. The other HOA members, who had been so sure of their control over the lake, now looked to one another for guidance, unsure of how to respond. Diane's authority had crumbled in front of them. The foundation of everything she had worked for was now being questioned, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But despite the documentation and the undeniable truth of the situation, Diane wasn't ready to give up. "We need to verify this," she said, her voice rising in desperation. "This could be some kind of mistake. We've invested so much in this community. We can't just hand it over without proper legal verification." I had expected this. Diane wasn't going to accept defeat so easily. But I wasn't interested in debating her anymore. The truth was on my side, and I wasn't backing down. "I'll give you time to verify it," I said, my tone firm. "But in the meantime, I'm going to continue using the lake, as I've always had the right to do." The HOA members looked at each other, clearly at a loss for words. And that's when I knew I had won. Diane's grip on the situation had slipped, and she knew it. As she walked away, her shoulders slumped, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But the battle wasn't over. The HOA had already spent hundreds of dollars trying to fight me, using community funds to fund their personal vendetta. And as much as I wanted to walk away from it all, I knew that I couldn't. This wasn't just about fishing. It was about standing up for what was right, about protecting the legacy my father had left me. The days that followed were a blur. Diane continued her campaign of intimidation, posting pictures of me fishing on the community bulletin board, calling in security to patrol the lake, and trying to use every tactic she could think of to force me out. But the more she pushed, the more the community began to turn against her. Neighbors who had once supported her began to ask questions. They saw how she was misusing their HOA funds, how she was bullying me for no reason other than her own obsession with control. One evening, during a tense HOA meeting, the truth finally began to come to light. Residents who had been kept in the dark about the situation began to speak out. "Why are we spending money to fight someone who's not bothering anyone?" one longtime resident asked. "I've seen him by the lake every day, just sitting quietly, fishing. Why are we trying to make this into a bigger problem than it is?" The tide of public opinion began to shift. Diane could feel it. She could feel the walls closing in on her. But it wasn't until Betty Williams spoke again that everything truly changed. "I remember your father," Betty said, her voice steady. "He fought for this lake. He believed in keeping it accessible to everyone. And now, his son is here, doing the same thing. This lake belongs to him, and we need to respect that." The room fell silent. Diane stood there, her face pale, as the reality of what had happened set in. The community had turned. They were no longer on her side. And then came the final blow. At the next HOA meeting, Diane stood before the community, her voice shaky but sincere. "I owe everyone, especially Mr. West, a sincere apology," she said, her words slow, as if each one was a weight she had to bear. "I was so committed to protecting what I believed belonged to the community that I refused to accept evidence that contradicted my assumptions. I let my fear of losing control turn me into someone I'm not proud of being." For the first time, Diane wasn't the authoritative figure she had always been. She was vulnerable. She was human. And as I listened to her apology, I realized that this was the first step toward healing, for her, for me, and for the entire community. "I understand," I said, my voice softer now. "You were just trying to protect something you believed in. But now we know the truth. And we can all move forward, together." The rest of the community, the neighbors who had once stood on opposite sides, began to realize that the lake was not just about ownership, it was about community. It was about coming together, respecting each other, and preserving something that belonged to all of us. In the months that followed, the lake became a place of connection, not conflict. Diane, no longer consumed by her need to control, channeled her energy into organizing community events. Families came to the lake to enjoy its beauty, and the fishing community found that sharing the space brought them closer together. Betty, who had been the quiet voice of reason throughout the ordeal, became an informal historian of the lake, telling stories of the past and helping the newer residents understand the unique history of the land. And as for me, I continued to test my fishing nets, but I also found myself spending more time by the lake, reflecting on the journey that had brought us all together. My father's legacy was more than just a piece of land. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest conflicts lead to the strongest communities, and that the people who challenge us the most directly are often the ones who help us grow in ways we never expected. The lake, once a source of division, had become a symbol of what we could achieve when we chose to listen to each other, respect each other, and work together toward a common goal. And as I sat there, watching families enjoying the water, I knew that my father's vision had been realized. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.